Well, hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. We're so glad that you have come back and joined us for week 3 of our weekly Bible study at First Baptist Roswell. If we've not met yet, my name is Logan. I'm the Minister of Spiritual Development at the church, and we have started this online Bible study for those of you who are interested in doing it at home. So I hope you've enjoyed following along. If this is the first one you've seen, you might want to check out the first two. Each of our lessons are building on top of one another. And so look down in the comments below you right here, and you'll see links to the first two lessons that we've done so far in the book of Luke. To review, we've been talking about how Lent has been what we call a journey to the cross. And in the book of Luke, it is very much a journey for Jesus to get to the cross. And so we starting all the way back in chapter 9, that's not where we started, but it is where he starts heading towards Jerusalem. We see it over and over. Luke keeps reminding us Jesus is heading towards something bigger. He is making his way to Jerusalem, where ultimately he will meet his end, his death there. And so that is where we are now. We've had two stories that we really focused on his journey. The first one was the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. We learned about how Jesus is looking for people to be his disciples, looking for people to follow after him. And a big part of that is humility. This is not about appearances. This is about really meaning it from the heart, wanting to follow after Jesus wherever he leads. Last week in week 2, we looked at two different stories, two different men that come to Jesus and have an encounter with him and have two very different responses. The rich ruler came to him and said, "Hey, how do I get in on this? How do I have eternal life?" And he could not follow Jesus's hard commands. Zacchaeus, though, was the opposite. He was able to do what Jesus asked of him. He was able to follow and put God above all others, even his own wealth, his own possessions. And that's what Jesus calls all of us to do, that if we're going to follow him on this journey, then we have to put aside all other things and put him first so that we can follow wherever he leads. So Jesus has been on this journey, and now we have arrived. It is Holy Week, and we are in chapter 19 when Jesus does arrive into Jerusalem. And so right after Zacchaeus, he tells one more parable, one more story. And then you know the story of Palm Sunday. You can find it in chapter 19, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The crowds are cheering. He's riding a donkey's colt. It's a wonderful scene that we celebrated on Sunday morning, waving the palm branches, all those things. We had to do it without you in the room in worship, but we did celebrate Palm Sunday this past Sunday. And now he is in Jerusalem, and we're going to find out what he's up to. So I'll just tell you now, we're covering a lot of material because this is only our only lesson on Holy Week, and yet multiple chapters in the book of Luke cover it. So today is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to focus on one story. We're going to be covering a wide range of material. So I really encourage you, if you have a Bible, you're going to want it out. You can use Bible Gateway. But if you have a printed Bible, you're going to want to be able to follow along because we're going to be covering a lot of material today. So let's catch up of what he's doing in Jerusalem and find that out. Looking at Luke chapter 19, first thing he does once he gets to Jerusalem, verses 45 and 46. Then he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there. And he said, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of robbers." So first thing he does, he goes to the temple. He does not like what he sees there, cleans them out. Oftentimes you might have heard this called the temple tantrum. I mean, he goes off on them. He cleans out the people who are blaspheming it. And then it says this in 47 and 48. Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they have heard. So this is what Jesus is doing his first few days in Jerusalem. He is teaching in the temple. He goes there, and a lot of people want to hear what he has to say. He says a lot of things there that the religious leaders do not care for. And so really they start to put into motion some things to make happen in order to kill him. So that's where we end it in chapter 19. The next couple of chapters are certainly worth reading if you get the chance. Chapters 20 and 21 are a lot of those teachings of what he actually said. And many of those teachings are pointing to what happens later in the week. You might see at the very beginning of chapter 20, starting in verse 9, is the parable of the wicked tenants. A landowner keeps trying to get through to these people, finally sends his own son, but they kill him. Jesus is foreshadowing his death at the end of the week. There's a question about paying taxes, so he talks about that. A question about the resurrection. The Sadducees came. The Sadducees were one, if you see in verse 27. The Sadducees came and were questioning Jesus about the resurrection because Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, which is why they were so sad, you see. And so he's answering questions about that. Well, that obviously also points to the end of the week when he will be resurrected and conquer death, but we're not there yet. We see more teachings starting in verse 21 and in verse 21:7. It talks about looking for signs. Pay attention. Things are happening. That's what Jesus is telling us here. Big things are happening. Are you paying attention? We see in verse 29, chapter 21, verse 29, he talks about a fig tree. You guys know a fig tree. You know what it looks like. You know that when it's about to start sprouting fruit because of what the leaves look like. Pay attention. God is doing something. What about the weather? You know that when a storm is coming, there are things that happen that point to that storm coming. Pay attention. God is doing something big. So we kind of, all these different things are pointing to what's coming later in the week. And so that's all of chapters 20 and 21. Again, if you get a chance to read through them sometime, a lot of wonderful teachings really pointing to the end of the week. So what we're focusing on today, though, is chapters 22 and 23. And really, there's no way for us to cover just in this video, in just in one lesson, everything that happens in chapters 22 and 23. We are going to hit a lot of the highlights, but this is really where there have been teachings before, and it was kind of a documentary showing what Jesus is about. It becomes an action movie, a lot of action in 22 and 23. And so read those teachings in 20 and 21 as, you know, with the context in mind that he's in Jerusalem. This is what he wants people to know before he goes, before his ministry comes to an end with his death and then resurrection. But in 22 and 23, really pay attention. In fact, here's what I want to ask you to do. If you have your Bible open or can get to Bible Gateway, which you're watching this, you might be watching this on the internet. Some of you might be watching it on DVDs. If you have a chance, open up your Bibles, and it would be helpful if you just right now stop and read chapters 22 and 23 all the way through as one entire narrative as they were intended. We've talked before about the original writings of the New Testament books did not have headings, did not have verses. They were meant as a narrative. And this story especially really pulls you in chapters 22 and 23 and tells you about all that Jesus went through in the last hours of his life. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you right now to pause the video, read through chapters 22 and 23 right now. Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope your reading went well. I hope you were able to do that. If not, no big deal. Do it when you can. Reading through those, what Jesus went through, I think really helps to prepare our hearts for Easter and the coming surprise in chapter 24. But don't read ahead yet. We're not there yet. We're going to end today in chapter 23. So Here is what I want us to focus on in our lesson today. Week 1, you remember, was all about the attitude that we should have in following Jesus. He's looking for followers. Week 2 was all about throwing off everything. Don't let anything hinder you from following God, as the writer of Hebrews says, right? Putting God above all else. That's the only way to be a disciple of Jesus. It's the only way to be his follower. Well, week 3, today, I want us to look at, what does that actually mean? Now what? What does that actually mean to be a follower of Jesus? If we're going to be like him, what kinds of things did he do? And there's some really interesting things. I don't know if you picked up on them in chapters 22 and 23 that Jesus does in these moments, even in the midst of really difficult times. He blesses other people over and over. I mean, this story right here in these chapters is about immense suffering and persecution. It's about really difficult times that he's going through. And yet, over and over through these chapters, we have multiple instances of him putting others first and seeking to bless other people, even though he is going through some of the worst things that a person can go through. And this is a special focus of Luke. Luke really wants us to know that being a disciple of Jesus ought to mean that we're like him. And being like him means that when other people encounter us, they should experience God. They should be blessed by being in our presence. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the book of Luke. All the way back in Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist even is out there baptizing people in Jesus' name and encouraging them to follow after him. And some people say, okay, we've done that. Now what? And he says, well, here's what. If you have 2 coats, give one to someone who has no coats. Hey, tax collectors, don't collect too much money. Hey, soldiers, don't extort people and use your power and lord it over them. Following Jesus means that we ought to be doing things that bless other people, that give a positive influence to the world. We see that all throughout the book of Luke. Over and over, Jesus meets people and they walk away better because of it. He heals them. He teaches them new ways of abundant living. Over and over, we see this. People healed of a disability. This goes through the entire book where over and over, people are blessed by being around Jesus. This ends with Zacchaeus, our story from last week. His encounter with Jesus meant that he was never going to be the same again. So, for our scripture passage today, we're going to be looking at some instances from chapters 22 and 23 and going through, remember, this is a broad overview of all these things that happened in the last few hours of his life. So instead of being amongst horrible suffering, instead of succumbing to that and making it only about what he was going through, and remember, he was going through a lot. Betrayal by a friend, wrongfully accused of something. Everybody seems to hate him. He is physically beaten. He is humiliated and made fun of, and still Jesus looks for ways to bless others. All right, so let's look at some of those now. Luke chapter 22, verses 31 to 34 say this. This is Jesus speaking in verse 31. Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied me 3 times. So during the Last Supper, Jesus could have looked at Peter and said, I know that I have a lot going on. I know that you don't have the strength to stand by me in my darkest hour, and I'm really disappointed to hear that. But instead he said, I need you Or I'm going to pray for you. Instead of asking for their prayers, instead of listing prayer requests of all the prayer that he was going to need, he said, Simon, I am praying for you. And listen, I know you're going to fail me. I know you're going to fail me. And yet still, I ask that when you come back, because I know that God's also going to bring you back, use that strength to strengthen those around you. So I'd ask you today, even when you're in a difficult moment, can you still pray for others? Has there been times when your faith has failed, and can you look back and see how God might want to use those moments to strengthen other people? All right, then Luke, our next one right there. So right there we see that Jesus, instead of asking for prayers, is even praying for other people in the midst of this difficult time. Right after this, let's follow and see Luke 22, 40 to 46 says this. Well, starting in verse 39. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. So every night, we saw this back in the last chapter, every night Jesus was going to spend the night out in the Mount of Olives. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then the angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief, and he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." And so Jesus is greatly distressed, so much so that his sweat has turned into blood. Scientists and doctors have shown that this is a true phenomenon. When someone is truly so stressed and at their wits' end, this can happen. And Jesus knows what's about to come and is rightfully afraid of the pain, being fully human and fully God, knows of what is to come. And he first tells his disciples, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Again, he is looking out for their interests. And then at the end, when he finds them sleeping, he could have gone off on them. "How could you abandon me? How could you do this to me?" But instead he says, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Again, his focus is on them. His focus is on blessing them. You're going to need it, he says. Pray that you have the faith to withstand what is to come. Amazing. Going right into the very next passage, looking at Luke 22, verses 47 to 51. And it says this: "While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, 'Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?' When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, 'Lord, should we strike with the sword?' Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, 'No more of this.' And he touched his ear and healed him." So the disciples do not like that a crowd is coming to take away their master. They're angry that one of their best friends has left them and gone to get them and showed the people where they could find Jesus. And so they're rightfully angry about it. And so the disciples want to attack Jesus, or attack the crowd on behalf of Jesus. And all we see is them asking for permission and then running on ahead. So Jesus never answers, "Yes, please attack on my behalf." He's thinking even of the people across the way from him. And so you can imagine the high priest is not going to do this work, but he is there, and he sends his slave across the field to get Jesus, and one of the disciples will not have it, and he attacks him, and he cuts off his ear, swings a sword, and thankfully misses and just gets his ear. And Jesus says, "No more of this. I'm not going to have any violence in my name." even though he could have made an argument that he was being wrongfully accused and he shouldn't have to go with them. And what's more, Luke is the only gospel writer to record this detail, that he heals the slave. He gives him his ear back, and he says, this is not going to happen in my name. And all he does is let his words ring out against the religious leaders at this moment. He says this in verses 52 and 53. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day and day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. And so Jesus, true to his nonviolence principles, does not allow all this to happen, is looking out for everyone there, his disciples and the crowd, and said, there's not going to be violence in my name, but only uses his words and says, what you are doing is not right. You are arresting an innocent man under the power of darkness. But he willfully goes to not have any more of the scuffle between the two groups. So from there, a lot happens after this. Jesus has been taken away. He has been arrested by the religious leaders. Remember, now this was the Jewish religious leaders, the high priest Caiaphas, who had come with a crowd of people. They were the ones who wanted Jesus out of the way. The Jewish leaders could not have him rabble-rousing anymore in the temple, saying things against them in the temple. And so they have come to arrest him in the middle of the night. And so it's a long night for Jesus in the prison. You might have read that it talked about how the prison guards were beating him and mocking him throughout the night, all night long. They let him have it and tried to humiliate him. They blindfolded him so that he could not even see where it was coming from. A horrific night that Jesus endured. And so the next day he is brought all throughout the one morning. 4 different trials he has to stand after being beaten all night, after not allowed to get any sleep through the night. And so the first one is with the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders led by the high priest Caiaphas. And he's brought before them, and it's a farce of a trial. They try and get him to say things that would allow them to punish him. He does not give them what they want, and yet they act like he does. And so they say, that's all we need, even though he's done nothing wrong. They say, that's all we need. Let's take him to Pilate. Pilate will take care of this. Now, Pilate has no interest in squabbles among the Jewish people. His only interest is Rome. He is the Roman prefect of this area that includes Jerusalem. And so he's not interested in getting involved in their Jewish squabbles here. And so they come to him and he says, he asked Jesus some questions at the beginning of chapter 23. And he says, he goes through these questions and he says, I can find no basis for an accusation against this man. And so, but they say, but he's been doing all these things. You got to listen to us. You got to take care of this. He's been doing this since he was in Galilee, right? And Pilate says, whoa, Galilee. Okay, I heard that. Herod's in charge of Galilee. Let him take care of it. I don't want any part of this. Pilate sends him over to Herod. Herod won't even try him, asks him a couple questions, but ultimately just makes fun of him, treats him with contempt, mocked him. They mock him with a fake royalty robe and say, not our problem, we're not dealing with it, sends him back to Pilate. That was the 3rd trial. The 4th trial, finally back to Pilate, and Pilate says, I want no part of this. He's done nothing wrong, but he is in a pickle here. He can try Jesus again and still find him innocent, find no basis for an accusation against the man, but the crowds now have turned against Jesus. Earlier in the week, they were shouting his name, but the religious leaders that they are supposed to be able to trust have riled up the people against him, have falsely accused Jesus, have poisoned their minds against Jesus. And the crowd say, we want Jesus gone. We want him dead. And so Pilate releases a true criminal and instead orders the execution of Jesus. And so this is where we pick up, where we see more of what Jesus is about in these last hours of his life. We're in Luke chapter 23, verses 27 to 31. He is now walking towards the hill where he will be crucified. Verse 27 says this: "A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen to it when it is dry?'" And so Jesus is walking to his execution, right? The crowds are following him there to make sure it happens. But there's a group of women who are on his side, who see the wrong that have happened and hate to see it, and they are wailing in grief. And if anyone should have been wailing for grief, it should have been everyone. If anything should have been happening, it should have been people grieving what was happening, an innocent man about to go to death. But he says, "Don't cry for me. Weep for yourselves. Terrible things are about to happen." And so he is, even in this moment, only concerned about other people as he's going to his own death. And then a couple more instances happen. He gets there. He is nailed up to the cross. And this is what it says in Luke 23:34. "Then Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.'" Even in this moment, he is asking God to forgive the people who are doing this. Say they don't realize what they're doing. Forgive them. Even in this moment, he is looking towards others. And then right there in the same chapter, picking up in verse 39, it says this, 39 to 43 says this: "One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, 'Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us.' But the other rebuked him, saying, 'Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.' Then he said, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' Jesus replied, 'Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.'" So while on the cross, Jesus is hanging on a piece of wood only by the nails that have been driven through him. How could he think of anything else other than the wrongful pain and suffering that he is enduring? And yet still he has it within himself to twice put others ahead of himself, twice think of the other people around him. He asked God to forgive them. And then one of the criminals is mocking him. Can you believe it? Hanging on the cross next to him, mocking him. But the other realizes that something is happening, realizes how special Jesus is, and says, "You are innocent. I see something in you that needs to be followed. Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "I will. You'll be with me in paradise today." It's an interesting thing. We have focused in our previous 2 weeks on stories of two different people, two different men in each story. One gets it right and one gets it wrong. The Pharisee and the tax collector, it kind of turned things on its head. It wasn't the religious leader who got it right, but it was the truly repentant tax collector. Zacchaeus and the rich ruler, it wasn't the pious, well-respected ruler who got it right. It was the tax collector who had been extorting people but made things right. And here we have two people. One gets it right and one gets it wrong. One man still to the bitter end, so full of hate, so full of bitterness, cannot bring himself to be repentant even at the end. And yet one man with only the last few breaths of his life is able to do it right, is able to say, Jesus, remember me. Jesus is giving out salvation to the very end. Do you remember last week we talked about Jesus' mission statement? At the end of the Zacchaeus story, it says this. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." He is fulfilling that mission even in his last breaths with someone else right next to him who is dying. The Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Jesus is fulfilling his mission even in the end. So no matter what we're going through, it seems clear to me that if we're supposed to be like Jesus, we can still be looking for ways to bless others, still be looking for ways to participate in God's loving kingdom work in the world. Now, I want to be clear. This is not to say that when you're going through a difficult time, you should neglect yourself, or you should not give yourself the care needed to move past it, to get better, whatever that might be. But it is abundantly clear in these passages that if we are open to the opportunities, God can use us even we're in the midst of some of the worst times of our lives. We're in the middle of darkness. God might just have an opportunity for us to serve others, to bless other people. And Jesus knows what it's like. He's been there. If you read all the way through chapters 22 and 23, it's hard for us to imagine us going through much worse than that. Hebrews 4 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are." Jesus knows what it's like to go through miserable, difficult times, and yet still was fulfilling his mission to bless the world through it. Oftentimes we can look back on tough times in our life. I know for one I have, when I didn't understand what was going on, and I can say, I can now see, I look back and I reflect and I can see what God was doing during that time. But Jesus' life demonstrates that in those moments, in the midst of them, we can be open to them right then. We don't have to wait till they're over to look back and see where God is at work in our life. If we are open to it, if we are looking, God can use us at any time in any way to benefit the world. Back in Luke 7, Jesus was called the friend of tax collectors and sinners. And here we see it with all the people that he encountered in this story. We see it every day in our own lives. Jesus is a friend of us, sinners. So think about this today. Are people blessed by being around you like they were being around Jesus? Why or why not? Or how about this? How can you serve and bless others even in the midst of hard times? Some of us are going through hard times right now. It's hard for us to be in our homes, locked away from other people. Is there a way, if you're open to it, that God might be calling you still to bless others during this time? How about this? Can you look back on a time when someone else blessed you, even though you know they were going through it? They were going through difficult times, and they still blessed you. And how can you prepare, even if you're not feeling it right now? We all go through hard times. We all have difficulties. How can you prepare your heart now to be open to God in those moments when they come? So next week, we're going to look at the culmination of what happens through all of this. We see along the way that Jesus was blessing people every step of the way in his life. But those were all little steps. God was actually working on multiple levels throughout this entire thing. People were encountering Jesus on a one-on-one basis, on a one versus the crowd basis. But we're going to see next week how God used these moments to actually bless the entire world. All of this mission, Jesus' mission to seek out and save the lost, was part of a larger story that God might do this through him for the entire world. So I'm excited for that lesson. I hope you'll tune in again next week. The story that we ended on today was a dark ending. Chapters 22 and 23 are not that fun to read through. And at the end of chapter 23, we see the burial of Jesus. Chapter 23 ends, Jesus is dead. But as the famous preacher S.M. Lockridge says, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. I hope you'll join us again next week, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks, everyone.